Have you ever wondered how a country can be hijacked, how institutions can be subjected, perverted, and corrupted, and perhaps most importantly, how to identify the moment in which a democracy, after being taken over, stops working? Dear viewer, those questions have pervaded global politics, but especially they've pervaded Latin American politics.
Nuestra generación vive una crisis de identidad que se manifiesta en un permanente cuestionamiento de los valores tradicionales de nuestra cultura y asume, en muchos casos, las concepciones nihilistas de la subversión antinacional.
Esta nunca ha sido dictadura, señores. Esta es dicta blanda. Pero si es necesario, vamos a tener que apretar la mano, porque tenemos que salvar primero el país y después miraremos atrás.
For the last few decades, numerous Latin American leaders have taken control of their countries. Sometimes they did it through coups d'etats, but in many other occasions, these dictators came to power through democratic means. That is precisely the case of Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega. Here at VisualPolitik, we've already told you about this political figure, how he came to power, how he behaved, and how he was responsible for the huge strikes that Nicaragua has been going through in 2018.
No quiero que se vayan del país con el cachismo real, que se vayan a la cárcel.
Strikes that have been answered with a heavy hand and which have led to terrible consequences. More than 200 people have lost their lives, hundreds have been detained, and thousands have been injured. Well, in this video, we're going to take a look at another aspect of the events. This is the story of how a government managed to take control of the state and make the institutions work, not for the country, but for itself. This is the story of how a kind of political mafia took control of Nicaragua. So, listen up. The year, it's 2006, and Daniel Ortega wins the Nicaraguan presidential elections. After 16 years as the opposition, the Sandinista leader returned to the country's presidency. The precedents weren't exactly good. His first term as president between 1985 and 1990 was frankly terrible. Ortega left an economically and socially shattered country. It was a country that went through a war, ended up with a foreign debt 6 times bigger than its GDP, and suffered from hyperinflation that reached the astronomical figure of 33.547% by 1987. To give you an idea of the magnitude of this disaster, in 1990 the per capita income of Nicaragua was 55% smaller than the country had registered back in 1978. In other words, compared to Daniel Ortega, even the Kirchners would get good grades. Folks, Ortega's economic model, it was a huge failure. The expropriations, the gigantic foreign debt, the unstoppable money printing, and his obsession with controlling the economy, it all led Nicaragua into an unsustainable situation. And I mean, how wouldn't it have with that recipe? And if we add the Contras conflict to all of this, financed by the United States, the country was submerged in a complete disaster. By the way, for those of you who don't know, the Contras were paramilitary groups financed by Washington through selling weapons to Iran when this country was in the middle of a war with Iraq, a country that was supposedly close to Washington. In short, a lot of nonsense. So throughout the following decades, the country only had one mission. That was simply to recover from this hideous mess.
Ni siquiera puede haber Nicaragua sin libertad, porque el alma y la razón de ser de Nicaragua es la libertad.
To do this, the following government, starting with that of Violeta Chamorro, by the way, the first elected female Latin American president, decided to turn the country's political and economic approach right around. That is, to move from a centralized economy, which was organized and directed by the state, to a market economy. That's how the Nicaraguan free trade zones were born, as well as the policies to attract foreign investment, which, along with international cooperation and especially the growing remittances from abroad, allowed Nicaragua to get back on track. But hold on just a moment here, because what these new governments didn't achieve was putting an end to corruption. Thus, scandal after scandal, the feeling of frustration, disappointment, and deceit that all Nicaraguans felt, along with an opposition who was willing to do almost anything to return to power, fueled Ortega's victory in 2006. And here, dear viewers, is where the new story begins, especially because Ortega wasn't going to waste his return to power. This was his chance. This was his opportunity to dominate Nicaraguan politics, finances, and society. But to achieve this, and above all to prevent an electoral process from re-evicting him from the presidency, he needed to seize political power with an armed force and an economic monopoly. This is the strategy he set in motion and the steps he took to achieve his purpose. So listen up.
Political power.
Obviously, his strategy's first goal was to achieve political hegemony and social control by any means necessary. This was very clear to Ortega from the beginning, and he launched a double tactic to achieve it. First, by invading the institutions and centralizing power, and then by limiting and intimidating the opposition, something for which fear is usually a very, very effective ingredient. Therefore, shortly after arriving, Ortega launched a paramilitary force composed of gang members. We're talking about shock groups better known in Nicaragua as the Turbas.
They are feared, and the people call them mobs. They usually wear t-shirts that speak of love and peace, wear helmets to hide their faces, and move on motorcycles. They're mostly very violent young people. Matilde Cordova, journalist in Managua.
Its objective? Well, that would be to intimidate the political opposition, to frighten those who disagree with the government, and to try and dismantle the opposition's demonstrations or concentrations with violence. Obviously, it isn't an official force, but they have the government's protection, and we're going to see how that works in just a moment.
We can say that a paramilitary force has been set up in Nicaragua that is composed of gang members. Sometimes we get on a bus and a paramilitary member is watching us. Aide Castillo, Nicaraguan activist.
But of course, it doesn't end here. The next step to achieve total political control is to take control of the state institutions. And, well, how do you think he did that? Well, first, political decentralization had to be ended, in this case, municipal autonomy. Thus, in Nicaragua, Ortega's political henchmen have managed to dismiss mayors at will. Something like, hey, if you've got a political rival, just kick him out of the race. That way, you don't only get rid of your opponents, you also win loyal fans who, of course, don't want to risk making you mad, right? The second step to institutional takeover was to create and legitimize his own political organizations, in this case, the Citizen Power Councils. These bodies, which supposedly involve community participation, in practice have the objective of creating a parallel political structure that is recognized and controlled by the government. And the third, appoint and achieve the indefinite permanence of his party associates in every key state position: the electoral power, the judicial power, and the general comptroller. And if an official protests, I mean, that's what those mobs are for, right? So how about two examples of proving what Ortega achieved with this strategy? Well, check this out. On the one hand, the Nicaraguan constitution prohibited the consecutive re-election of a president, so Ortega would have completed his term in 2011. However, as Hernandez did in Honduras, Ortega managed to get the Constitutional Chamber of the Supreme Court, composed mostly of Sandinista magistrates, to declare Article 147 as inapplicable, which is the one that prevented the presidential consecutive re-election. In exchange, the magistrates' positions were insured for life. Quite the exchange. On the other hand, in 2011, fraud suspicions were so intense that both the European Union and the Organization of American States concluded that they weren't sure of the results. You know who controlled the electoral power? Yes, it would be Ortega, and he made sure that his followers could do and undo whatever they wanted. In fact, in the following elections, the 2016 ones, they didn't even split, and the ruling party took full control of the process. But hold on a moment, you might be thinking, wasn't there a big scandal because of this, Simon? Well, let's say that the president had made sure that practically every major media station in the country was controlled by his family or their associates.
The Ortega family monopolizes the media in Nicaragua.
Mobs and the occupation of institutions and the media, well, this is the political side, but there's much more.
The force monopoly.
Of course, for as much as he holds political power, if a dictator doesn't hold the military force, he's taking a huge risk. This was very clear to our protagonist, so the second pillar of this strategy was to take over the police and to take over the army. To do so, he took advantage of his majority in the National Assembly. As soon as he got to power, Ortega pushed a reform that placed the ability to appoint new faculties of the National Police and the Army of the Republic in his hands. Then, taking advantage of these new possibilities, he placed relatives and loyal people directly in charge of these institutions. For example, the police are directed by his own father-in-law, Francisco Diaz. This means he can get the police to look the other way when the mobs act, and when the opposition strikes, repression, and, well, more repression. Because when the mafia holds the power, it's not easy for them to let go. Well, we've covered politics and we've covered force, but there's still a third element missing.
El capitalismo salvaje.
Economic power.
The third pillar in this strategy was to achieve economic power for three reasons. First, to prevent Nicaraguan capital from supporting an alternative. Second, to get resources with which to carry out Ortega's plans. And third, perhaps the most important point, to fill his pockets. Throughout this time, corruption has been brutal, to such an extent that the Ortega Murillo family are millionaires. See, they've taken over the media, they hold high positions in the state, they've even taken over oil import and distributions in Nicaragua. They've put themselves in charge of the investment promotion agencies, with a plan that we could describe like this. Want to invest in Nicaragua? Great, we'll make it happen, but you have to give me a commission. You know, for the country. They've also reached agreements with businessmen, apparently by getting loyalty and envelopes in exchange for privileges. A clear example of this way of doing things was the agreement made to build the Interoceanic Canal, a seemingly unsuccessful project, but in which the government reached an under-the-table agreement with Wanji Jin, the Chinese developer working on it. At first, the state kept half of the profits, and then, with a last-minute change, it became 1%. Obviously, the businessman did some last-minute haggling. In short, dear viewer, the fact is that with political power, with brute force, and with economic power, Daniel Ortega became the owner and lord of Nicaragua, and also a billionaire. And just in case, in the last election in 2016, he presented Rosario Murillo, his wife, as vice president. So everything certainly stays in the family. Dear viewer, this is essentially the same thing that happens in Venezuela. It is, so to speak, the manual for a dictator. And the question we can ask ourselves now is, can we really pretend that Nicaragua is still a democracy? Well, leave your opinion in the comment section below, and as always, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done that. And I really hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to check out Reconsider Media. They do a podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode. It's all great stuff. Also, as always, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on Patreon. Please consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.